He could not remember the exact moment when the thought first took root, but once it did, Eddard Stark found himself incapable of banishing it from his mind. It was a shadowy whisper that seemed to weave itself between his most deeply held principles, a question that gained weight with every passing day. What if he took matters into his own hands and ended the reign of Robert Baratheon to spare the realm from further devastation? It was inconceivable at first, a notion that clashed with every fiber of his honor, every vow he had sworn. Yet it persisted, a quiet murmur in the dead of night and an unsettling echo whenever he looked upon the man he had once called friend. A long time had passed since they had ridden side by side, young men brimming with hope for a new future. Robert Baratheon had held the realm's heart in his gauntlet fist, wild and noble, the very symbol of rebellion against the Mad King. In those days, Eddard Stark had never questioned Robert's capacity to rule wisely. He had believed in him as a friend, as a brother in arms, and as the rightful king who would shepherd the Seven Kingdoms toward peace and stability. Yet the passage of years had eroded that trust. The king, grown corpulent and drunk on both wine and power, seemed more intent on hunting boars or chasing skirts than tending to the crown's responsibilities. The tension in the realm had grown palpable, a fraying tapestry, and Ned could sense the threads unraveling beneath Robert's inattentive gaze. Those who knew Eddard Stark intimately recognized his distaste for politics and court intrigue. He was a man of simpler values, believing in duty, justice, and the honor of fulfilling promises. Yet the gods, or the twists of fate, had seen fit to place him at the center of a treacherous capital, surrounded by conspirators who wore polite smiles and spoke the language of secrets. He had come for the sake of duty, and he had lingered, burdened by a sense of responsibility toward the realm that neither the king nor the queen seemed inclined to uphold. Each passing moon in King's Landing made him more aware of the corruption that seeped through every corridor of the Red Keep. Whispers of Lannister gold, the manipulations of Littlefinger, the cunning of Varys, the silent judgments of Pycelle. Ned had found them all distasteful, yet he did not flinch from them. He was determined to protect the realm, if for no other reason than he had promised to do so. But the rot had spread too far, and in the nights that followed one particular discovery, a secret that turned his entire world upside down, his convictions started to shift. The children that Robert called his own were not Robert's at all. They were products of the Queen's illicit union with her own brother. The king, oblivious or willfully blind, wielded power as though he were a puppet to the Lannisters, though he might never admit it. Ned realized that if Robert should learn the truth the wrong way, it might plunge the realm into another war. Indeed, it threatened to tear the kingdom asunder. A quiet desperation enveloped Ned. He remembered the promise he had once made to his dying sister, Lyanna, in the Tower of Joy. He remembered the savage toll war had taken on the realm. He remembered the fragile trust the great houses placed in the crown. And he realized something more terrifying than anything else. Robert's inability to rule might prove just as destructive as the madness of Aerys Targaryen before him. He weighed his options late at night, pacing across cold marble floors in a small chamber within the Red Keep. He tried to speak to Robert, to warn him about the Lannisters, about the tensions that threatened to set the kingdom aflame. But the king dismissed him, as if Ned's concerns were trifles not worthy of his notice. The realm, as Robert saw it, was an endless feast, and the seat of the Iron Throne was merely a vantage point to watch the spectacle of knights and tourneys, women vying for his favor, and noble lords paying lip service to his power. He drowned himself in wine to forget the burdens of the crown. Ned's voice could not pierce that oblivion. Still, Ned resisted the dark kernel of an idea that had lodged itself behind his eyes. Perhaps it was the product of frustration. Perhaps it was the voice of the North, whispering that the realm needed a strong hand. Whatever it was, it beckoned him to consider. If Robert would not abdicate, if he would not see reason, and if he insisted on dragging the realm toward ruin, then someone had to act. Honor warred with necessity, and at times, especially when he encountered the misery in the streets, the complaints of small folk, or the battered limbs of soldiers left to beg, honor found itself overshadowed by a sense of righteous fury. The day everything shifted irrevocably came unexpectedly. as is often the case with fate's cruel designs. Robert had been on one of his infamous hunts, accompanied by a retinue that included his younger brother Renly, some of his closest knights, and a handful of attendants. Ned had been invited but had declined, preferring to occupy himself with more urgent matters, like ensuring the city's supplies were adequately stocked for an upcoming festival. But a messenger arrived at the Red Keep in the dead of night, sweat soaking his brow, stammering out a report that the king was gravely injured by a boar. The creature had gored Robert, and his condition was dire. Ned rushed to the royal chambers where Robert was being treated. The corridors were awash in a hush that felt unnatural for such a bustling place. Servants and nobles alike wore haunted expressions. Outside the king's chambers, the queen stood with her hand on Prince Joffrey's shoulder. She glanced at Ned, and for a moment, something flickered in her green eyes. Fear, anger, or perhaps something more cunning. Ned scarcely noticed, for when he entered the room, his entire focus fell upon Robert Baratheon's supine form. The man was pale, his face twisted in pain, his breath rattling with each exhale. A bandaged wound at his side was soaked with blood despite Grand Maester Pycelle's best efforts. Robert tried to speak, but his words came in gasps. He gestured for everyone else to leave, and only Ned remained by his bedside. In that moment, the old bonds between them felt tangible, reminding Ned of the days when Robert's laughter had rung out like thunder, when they had both been certain that the world could be remade by the strength of their arms and the purity of their aspirations. He heard a strangled confession from Robert, regrets about not being a better king, lamentations about the estrangement between him and his queen, bitter remarks about how the throne was a cursed seat that took everything from a man. Ned's heart, heavy with conflict, tightened. It was the perfect moment for the truth. He could tell Robert about the parentage of his children, how Cersei had deceived him, or he could tell him that it was time to name a successor who would rule with wisdom. But Ned saw the delirium in his old friend's eyes, the fever that muddled his mind. There would be no clarity here. Across the room, the flicker of torchlight emphasized the worn edges of Robert's form. "Let me die as I lived, Ned," the king groaned. "Wine? Fetch me wine." Ned saw the demand as a final indulgence. Even in death, Robert wanted to drown himself in oblivion. Maester Pycelle muttered something about the king not needing more wine, but Robert growled, cursing the old man for meddling. Ned stood there, holding the cup and feeling a swirl of unnameable sorrow. In all his hopes for the realm, he had never dared to imagine it without Robert. For all the man's flaws, he was the link that bound the great houses in the aftermath of the rebellion. Without Robert, the chaos that threatened might break free. And yet, chaos was already poised to break free, wasn't it? Ned considered the children, the Lannisters, the conspiracies that held King's Landing in a web. He considered the hungry stares of Stannis and Renly, each with a claim to power. He considered the spider's webs that men like Varys and Littlefinger spun. Could the realm survive if Robert died naturally from his wounds? Or did Ned himself have a role to play in ensuring stability? He tried to cast the thought away, but in that moment, his gaze flickered to the dagger in his belt. A single plunge, swift and sure, could spare the realm from 1,000 further ills. A mercy, or so a darker corner of his conscience whispered. It was an echo he detested, one that he might have expected from men like Tywin Lannister or Peter Baelish, but never from himself. The king looked up at him, half lucid, blinking as though trying to see Ned clearly. Was there recognition in those eyes? Some silent plea? Robert's next words were slurred. "Take care of my son," he murmured. "He's all I leave behind." Ned's stomach lurched. He knew the boy was not Robert's trueborn child, but the weight of the promise was real nonetheless. Robert's last pleas echoed in Ned's mind, reverberating off the old vow he had made to Lyanna, and off the love he once bore this man. They clashed and tangled in an inner storm. Outside, in the hallway, chaos reigned. Men who had heard of the king's dire condition were stirring up plots. The seeds of civil war were already sprouting. Cersei, with her cunning, would move swiftly to secure the throne for Joffrey. Renly might demand a regency. Stannis would likely stake a rightful claim, for he was the elder Baratheon after Robert. The North, as always, would be a distant realm, but Ned had no doubt that if the lines of succession were questioned, his own homeland would be forced into the fray. The entire realm would bleed once more. The question was not if, but when. Suddenly, Robert choked, his breathing ragged. Ned leaned forward, calling for a maester, but the maester was too slow, fumbling with bandages and potions. Panic seized Ned's chest as Robert's face contorted in agony. This was it. This was the moment. He felt an unexpected sense of calm settle over him, as though the gods had granted him one final chance to spare the realm from the savage unpredictability that would follow if Robert died in that bed without a clear path to stable succession. His fingers brushed the hilt of his dagger. It would be a mercy, he told himself. A clean death, offered by a friend rather than the ravages of an agonizing wound. Honor and love merged into a single terrible decision. He drew the blade slowly, so quietly that only the barest whisper of steel sounded in the torchlit chamber. Robert's eyes widened, perhaps in surprise or recognition. Ned steeled his heart, recalling how the realm had suffered under Aerys and how Robert, in his own way, had allowed suffering to creep back in, disguised by revelry and indifference. The blade sank into Robert's chest, sliding between ribs. Ned's hand pressed over the king's mouth to stifle any cry. Robert's eyes, once so full of laughter and life, flared in that final moment. Ned's breath caught in his throat, tears slipping down his cheeks in an agony of regret and resolve. Then Robert's body slackened, his last exhale brushing over Ned's hand. It took mere seconds, but the weight of that act settled like an anvil upon Ned's soul. There was no turning back from this moment. He had ended the life of his friend, his king, and the man he had raised arms for. By all the laws of the Seven Kingdoms, Eddard Stark was now a kinslayer in spirit if not by blood, a regicide in fact. He swallowed hard, removing the blade and wiping it clean with trembling fingers. It was done. Robert Baratheon was dead, and Ned Stark had killed him. No one witnessed the moment. Pycelle had stepped out to gather more supplies, and the guards stationed by the door suspected nothing. Inside the chamber, Ned stared at the body, the man he had once followed with unshakable loyalty. A swirl of conflicting emotions threatened to break him. Guilt, sorrow, horror, and a strange, hollow sense of relief. He had taken a step that he once would have deemed impossible. He had crossed a line that he had believed inviolate. He had done so, he told himself, for the sake of the realm. Yet no matter how he tried to justify it, he could not ignore the truth. He had betrayed his friend. He had robbed the king of his final moments of peace. Perhaps the gods would curse him for it. Perhaps the realm would never forgive him. But it was too late to reconsider. Time pressed on him. Already, footsteps in the corridor signaled the approach of others. Ned needed to compose himself and decide on his next action. Instinct told him to arrange the scene in such a way that no suspicion would fall upon him. Yet another instinct, a deeper instinct born of decades of living by a code, told him to own what he had done. The realm was at stake, but so was his honor. Could he face the outraged lords and confess? Did he dare? He wiped the sweat from his brow and steadied his breathing. He sensed that if word spread that the king died of his wounds, the Lannisters would move quickly to claim power through Joffrey. That outcome would lead to a violent confrontation with the truth about Joffrey's parentage. But if Ned took charge immediately, he might guide the succession. He might ensure that the realm did not splinter. The plan formed in his mind with surprising clarity. He would keep Robert's death a secret for as long as possible, just long enough to maneuver. He would claim the regency in the name of the rightful heir. Who was that rightful heir? Stannis Baratheon, Robert's elder brother, was the lawful successor by all the laws of the land. Yet Ned knew that Stannis was a hard man, unyielding, with little love for the intricacies of political alliances. The realm might face a grim future under Stannis's unrelenting hand, but it would be a lawful future. However, the question teased at him, was there another path? Perhaps Ned himself, though not of Baratheon blood, could seize the Iron Throne in some capacity. Unthinkable though it was, the fleeting thought that had once seemed so impossible now felt closer. Robert's death at his own hand left him feeling both powerless and strangely emboldened. Cersei's footsteps in the corridor jerked Ned out of his stupor. He quickly knelt by Robert's side, arranging his hands over the wound to give the appearance that he was trying to save him. The door pushed open, and the Queen entered with her retinue. Guards, her son Joffrey, Grand Maester Pycelle, and others. She caught sight of the king's still form. Alarm flared in her eyes, but she swiftly masked it. She advanced on Ned, her face twisted in a combination of worry, suspicion, and something that may have been a glimmer of triumph. "Is he?" she began, and Ned nodded, pressing his lips into a solemn line. He did not speak. Joffrey broke away from his mother and ran to the bedside, but Ned quickly rose to block the boy's view of the wound. He announced gravely, "The king has passed." Whispers and gasps rippled through the crowd. Maester Pycelle rushed forward, checking for a pulse, but it was clear Robert was beyond rescue. Cersei's green eyes locked on Ned, unspoken questions burning in them. Ned held her gaze, carefully schooling his features to reflect only sorrow and duty. The Queen composed herself faster than Ned expected. "Then we must secure the realm," she said, her voice cracking at the edges just enough to suggest genuine grief. But Ned suspected her mind was already calculating. Joffrey is the king's heir. The succession must be maintained. Ned resisted the urge to betray what he knew. Instead, he spoke with a quiet authority. "Your Grace," he used the term carefully, neither confirming nor denying Joffrey's claim. "We must ensure the stability of the throne while we arrange a proper coronation. The people must not know of the king's death yet. If word spreads too quickly, we risk panic. Allow me to arrange the necessary proclamations." Cersei narrowed her eyes but did not object. She needed Ned's support, or so she believed, to maintain order in the immediate aftermath. The Lannisters, for all their power, still relied on the presence of the Stark name in King's Landing to avoid immediate accusations of foul play. They were cunning enough to know that if the North withdrew its support, the realm could fracture. For the moment, they needed Ned, just as Ned needed them to hold off on a swift coronation of Joffrey. So began the desperate dance of concealment and maneuvering. For a day, the realm remained in ignorance of Robert's passing. His body was prepared in secret, and only a handful of trusted attendants were permitted inside the chamber. Rumors circulated that the king's health had taken a turn for the worse, but the official statement was that he was merely recovering from his wounds. Ned used that time to send urgent ravens to those he could trust. Men in the north, some in the Riverlands, and a carefully worded message to the Vale. He invoked old loyalties and demanded discretion, hinting that the realm was at a crossroads. Yet even as he set these wheels in motion, Ned felt the growing weight of his guilt. In his quieter moments, alone in his private chamber, kneeling as though in prayer, he stared at his hands, still recalling the warmth of Robert's blood as it seeped over his skin. He prayed to the old gods for guidance, but the wooden faces in the small godswood of the Red Keep offered no comfort. He prayed to the Seven, though that was not his custom, wondering if any deity could pardon what he had done. Deep within, he doubted it. He could not sleep without seeing Robert's face. He could not eat without tasting ash on his tongue. And yet, curiously, he also felt a strange, grim determination. He had crossed the line. Now he had no choice but to move forward. On the second day, Cersei grew impatient. She confronted Ned in the small council chamber, flanked by Jaime Lannister and several gold cloaks. Her green eyes blazed with challenge. "We cannot hide the king's death forever, Lord Stark. The kingdom needs a ruler, and Joffrey must be named king." Ned braced himself. The small council was present, minus Littlefinger, who was mysteriously absent. Varys looked on with patient, unreadable eyes. Renly had left the city the moment he suspected Robert was at death's door, presumably to raise support for his own claim. Pycelle shifted nervously in his seat, glancing between Ned and the Queen. "My lords," Ned began. "We must proceed with caution. If we proclaim Joffrey king this instant, without ensuring the support of the lords in the realm, we risk rebellion. Stannis Baratheon is Robert's elder brother and has a strong claim under the law. He could contest Joffrey's succession, and the result would be civil war." Cersei's lips tightened. "Stannis is not here, and Joffrey is the recognized heir. There is no dispute." "There is dispute," Ned retorted quietly, though he took care not to reveal the secret about Joffrey's parentage yet. "The great houses will be uneasy if we do not honor tradition. At least give me the time to draft letters and assure the lords that Joffrey will respect the laws of the land. Without their acceptance, your son risks an unstable crown." Jaime bristled at this, his hand drifting casually toward the pommel of his sword. Tension in the room escalated rapidly. In that moment, it was Varys who intervened with a gentle cough, advising that they proceed with diplomacy. Ned silently thanked the eunuch for redirecting the confrontation. Cersei, though furious, relented. She agreed to grant Ned 3 days to prepare the official announcement, after which Joffrey would be proclaimed king of the Seven Kingdoms. Those 3 days were all Ned needed to orchestrate. He had a different plan entirely. He met secretly with Barristan Selmy, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, a man of undeniable honor. They spoke in hushed tones, discussing the vulnerabilities of Joffrey's claim. Selmy had served under Aerys and Robert. He remembered how quickly loyalty could be tested. Though he did not suspect Ned of wrongdoing, the knight was clearly troubled by the circumstances. Ned planted a seed of doubt about the boy on the throne. Selmy did not openly betray his vow to serve the king, but neither did he challenge Ned's insinuations. Ned left that meeting feeling slightly more assured that Barristan would not stand in his way if a legitimate challenge arose. Next, Ned reached out to those gold cloaks who were loyal to him, or at least to the memory of Robert's final commands. He promised them positions and silver if they would follow his lead when the time came. Littlefinger's absence made this task easier. The master of coins manipulations had always complicated such matters. With him gone, Ned managed to sway enough guards to ensure that when the day of reckoning arrived, he would not stand alone. All the while, Cersei's watchers kept tabs on him. He knew that spies for the queen, and likely for Varys as well, kept a close eye on his activities. So he had to move with caution. He disguised his intent, letting slip to certain parties that he was preparing to ensure Joffrey's smooth succession. Meanwhile, a handful of messages went out by Raven under coded language that only the Maester at Winterfell would understand. The night before the 3 days ended, Ned found himself in the Red Keep's God's Wood once again. The heart tree's face, carved long ago, seemed to peer into him with ancient judgment. He knelt, pressing his forehead to the trunk, tears threatening to escape. He could not help but recall the simpler life he had once led at Winterfell, a life where honor was clear-cut, where justice was not tangled in 1,000 intrigues. He whispered into the night air, "Lyanna, if you can hear me, forgive me. I have done what I thought was best." He remembered her face, pale and dying, and the promise he had made her. He remembered Robert's laughter, the thunder of hooves when they rode into battle, and the relief he had felt when the Targaryen dynasty had fallen. How painfully ironic that he now carried the stain of a regicide himself. Dawn came on the final day, pale and cool. A hush lay over King's Landing, as though the city itself sensed that a momentous change hovered on the horizon. Cersei dispatched her personal guard to summon Ned to the throne room, where the small council and the lords of note would gather. Word had been quietly spread among the nobles that a significant announcement concerning the king's health was forthcoming. They arrived in droves, curious and anxious, whispering behind their hands as the Red Keep's doors opened to them. Jaime Lannister stood near the throne, glaring at all who approached, his golden armor polished to a blinding sheen. Joffrey and Tommen were present, though Myrcella had been sent away, presumably to keep her safe. Sansa Stark stood off to one side, eyes gleaming with both nervousness and hope, for she had pinned all her youthful fantasies on Joffrey's ascension. Arya was nowhere in sight, likely training somewhere or exploring the depths of the castle in her tomboyish fashion. Ned walked in with measured steps, wearing a plain cloak that bore the direwolf sigil. He did not dress in finery. His bearing was somber, his expression unreadable. The crowd parted around him. Some whispered his name in tones of reverence. Others eyed him with suspicion. At the far end of the hall, the Iron Throne loomed, a twisted mass of metal that seemed to devour the dais. Beside it, Cersei stood in a gown of green and gold, Joffrey at her side in regal attire. It was a tableau of power. Ned felt his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Grand Maester Pycelle made a show of clearing his throat, and the gathered nobles fell silent. In a quavering voice, he began to speak of how the king, Robert Baratheon, had tragically passed from wounds sustained during his boar hunt. A murmur spread through the hall, hushed and disbelieving. Some had suspected this news, but the official confirmation still sent ripples of shock. Pycelle went on to say that the rightful heir, Prince Joffrey Baratheon, would now assume the crown of the Seven Kingdoms. "All hail King Joffrey," the Grand Maester declared. Jaime Lannister led a chorus of "Long live the King," but the cry was unsteady, lacking the thunderous unity that might accompany a beloved monarch's ascension. Cersei inclined her head, her golden curls gleaming in the torchlight, then gestured for Joffrey to step forward. The boy looked out at the sea of faces, half in fear, half in excitement. He swallowed, and Ned saw the nerves coiling in him like serpents. This was a child who wanted power but had no understanding of the burden it entailed. Cersei reached for the crown. Barristan Selmy, duty-bound, stepped up to crown Joffrey. Just as the gilded metal hovered over Joffrey's brow, a clear, firm voice rang out. "Stop!" The single word cut through the hush like a blade, and all eyes turned to Ned Stark. Cersei froze, her expression turning to ice. Jaime placed a hand on his sword hilt, as did several others. But Ned continued, his tone steady, his stance resolute. "I cannot permit this coronation until the rightful heir of Robert Baratheon is determined." An explosion of muttering ensued. Cersei hissed, "Lord Stark, how dare you interrupt?" She looked ready to signal the guards to seize him, but Ned had anticipated this. He raised a hand, signaling his men, the gold cloaks he had swayed, who swiftly moved to form a line behind him, weapons at the ready. The shift in power was palpable. Gasps echoed through the hall. Varys watched carefully, his face unreadable. Peter Baelish was still absent. Tyrion Lannister, newly returned from some journey, stood to the side with parted lips, as if he could not quite believe the spectacle unfolding. Little Shireen Baratheon was nowhere to be seen, and Stannis Baratheon had not yet arrived, though his name hung unspoken in the air. Ned's gaze swept over the throng of lords and ladies before he spoke again. "As Hand of the King, named so by Robert Baratheon himself, I have a responsibility to the realm. It has come to my attention that Prince Joffrey may not be the trueborn son of King Robert." The shock that overtook the room was immediate and visceral. Cersei's eyes burned with fury. Joffrey, confused and enraged, whipped his head toward his mother. Jaime's hand clenched on his sword. Many present glanced at the boy's golden hair, the same hue as the Lannisters. Ned continued, projecting his voice so that it carried to the far corners of the throne room. "By all the laws of the Seven Kingdoms, if Joffrey is not Robert's son, he has no claim to the throne. The rightful heir would be Lord Stannis Baratheon, Robert's elder brother. Until such a time as Stannis arrives to press his claim, I will hold the seat of power to maintain order in the realm." In that moment, pandemonium erupted. Some cried foul. Others demanded proof. Swords were drawn. Joffrey shrieked at Ned to silence himself. Cersei screamed at the guards to arrest him. The gold cloaks Ned had suborned rushed forward, forming a protective circle around him. The Hound stood near Joffrey, uncertain of whom to obey. Barristan Selmy, stunned, shifted his stance, as though uncertain whether to proceed with the coronation or respond to the uproar. Cersei, her voice high and sharp, spat accusations. "This is treason. Seize him. Kill him." She glared at Jaime, who hesitated, scanning the line of gold cloaks loyal to Ned. They outnumbered the guards loyal to the Queen at the moment, or at least seemed determined enough to enforce Ned's directive. Jaime knew better than to rush headlong into a losing fight. Still, violence sparked in his eyes, and the tension in the room teetered on a knife's edge. Ned seized the opportunity. He stepped forward, right in front of the Iron Throne, imposing himself between it and the crown. "I do not wish for bloodshed," he declared, "but I cannot allow a false claim. Surrender yourself, Queen Cersei, and submit to the judgment of the realm. We will wait for Lord Stannis' arrival, and the matter will be settled according to the law." Spittle flew from Joffrey's mouth as he hurled insults at Ned. "You lie. I am the king. I'll have your head on a spike." Cersei tried another tactic. She smoothed her face into a veneer of cool composure, addressing the assembled lords and ladies. "Look at what Lord Stark does. He usurps the throne, defying the will of King Robert. He brands the crown prince a bastard with no proof." Her voice rose in a dramatic pitch, designed to stir sympathy. "He claims to protect the realm, but he only seeks to place the crown on his own head." That last accusation caused a ripple of unease to roll through the crowd. Many regarded Ned with suspicion. The North had always kept to itself, and rumor had it that Ned was not the man to covet power. But circumstances, especially in King's Landing, could transform even the most honorable man. Ned met their stares head-on. His voice, calm yet firm, cut across the hall. "I do not claim the throne for myself. My loyalty is to the rightful king, and that is Stannis Baratheon. I will serve only as regent until he arrives. Let the realm know that." He paused, letting the echo of his words settle. "We need not turn this hall into a battlefield. Surrender, and I swear by the old gods and the new that you will be treated justly." For an instant it seemed there might be compliance. Jaime, though furious, studied the ring of soldiers around them. Barristan Selmy appeared torn. Tyrion Lannister watched from the edge, mind likely racing with strategies. Then, with a triumphant sneer, Cersei locked eyes with Ned and gave a subtle nod to a figure in the shadows. Littlefinger emerged from behind a column, his face a picture of regretful cunning. "You should never have trusted me," he said softly, almost apologetically, before stepping back into the darkness. All at once, a second contingent of gold cloaks, presumably those loyal to Littlefinger or purchased with Lannister gold, surged into the hall. A clash of metal on metal resounded as Ned's men realized they were no longer the sole guardians of the throne. A ferocious melee broke out in the wide space of the throne room, lords and ladies screaming as they scrambled for safety. Ned, shouting orders to his men, felt a surge of dread. He had hoped to avoid bloodshed, but treachery had won the first blow. Jaime Lannister drew his sword, letting out a war cry. Barristan Selmy moved to protect Joffrey from stray blows. Meanwhile, Ned's loyal gold cloaks engaged the new arrivals in a furious skirmish. The swirl of conflict, the clang of weapons, and the screams of the onlookers created a scene of raw chaos. Sansa Stark cried out in terror, pressing herself against a column. Arya, who had somehow entered the hall unnoticed, watched from a corner with wide, fierce eyes, a wooden training sword clutched in her hand as if she might do something foolish. In the midst of the chaos, Ned Stark advanced toward the Iron Throne, sword in hand, fending off an attacker's slash. A part of him hated this spectacle. It was everything he had tried to prevent. And yet, perhaps this was the only way to break the Lannisters' grip. He fought with disciplined grace, guided by a lifetime of training, cutting down those who threatened him or his men. Blood slicked the polished floor. He heard the ring of steel, the wet sound of blades cleaving flesh, the panicked shrieks. Through the sea of turmoil, he saw Joffrey cowering behind Cersei, and the sight stirred a pang of pity, for the boy was but a child, twisted by his mother's ambitions and lies. Still, Ned pressed forward. The tide turned in Ned's favor when several knights who respected his honor broke ranks from the Queen's side and refused to fight him. Men from the Reach who had long memories of Robert's rebellion, a few who still admired the Stark's reputation, They stood back, unwilling to spill blood for Cersei. Jaime found himself outnumbered, even with his skill. The Lannisters' gold cloaks fought fiercely, but they were disorganized in the face of Ned's prearranged plan. Blades clashed, armor rang out, and bodies fell. Before long, the bloodshed subsided as more gold cloaks laid down their arms, seeing no sense in continuing a losing battle. Cersei, her hair disheveled and her face twisted with hate, was seized by two of Ned's men. She let out a feral cry, accusing them of treason. Joffrey was pulled away, kicking and screaming, tears streaming down his cheeks. Jaime Lannister, his sword spinning in his hand, tried to break through to them, but at least 10 men circled him with spears. The Kingslayer might have fought to the death, but Cersei shouted for him to stand down. She realized the futility. Silence descended on the throne room, punctuated by the moans of the injured and dying. Ned Stark stood near the Iron Throne, his sword dripping blood onto the steps. Guards loyal to him surrounded the dais, and lords and ladies cowered at the edges of the vast chamber. The stink of death was heavy, the rush of adrenaline punishing. A hush seemed to fall, as if the very stones of the Red Keep were reeling from the violence. In that hush, Ned's breath caught. He knew what had to come next, though the thought of it twisted his guts. He gazed at Cersei, who knelt, her face contorted in a mask of rage and fear. Joffrey clung to her, trembling, while Jaime stood helpless. Ned wiped his blade clean on a fallen cloak, then sheathed it. He spoke, his voice resonating with a somber gravity that filled the hall. "Queen Cersei, for the crime of high treason, for conspiring to place a false heir upon the throne, you are under arrest. Prince Joffrey, likewise, will be held until the realm determines his fate. Ser Jaime Lannister, your actions in drawing steel against the hand of the king also place you under suspicion. You will all answer to the true king, or to the king's justice." He paused, letting the words sink in. All around, the watchers realized that the Lannisters' power had been temporarily broken. For the moment, Ned Stark's gambit had succeeded. But beneath his calm exterior, Ned's heart pounded with dread. He remembered the murder he had committed in that very castle, the blood of Robert Baratheon still fresh on his conscience. He told himself that he had done this to save the realm from another mad dynasty, that Robert had become a threat in his own right. But was that enough to justify it? Leaving a squad of loyal men to secure the throne room, Ned escorted Cersei, Joffrey, and Jaime to the dungeons personally. He refused to let them be harmed, for they were valuable not just as hostages, but as keys to preventing an immediate eruption of war with the Lannister armies. Along the way, Tyrion Lannister intercepted them. The imp's mismatched eyes flickered with something like concern, perhaps for his family, perhaps for the realm. "I wonder, Lord Stark," Tyrion said softly, "is there a plan here, or are we plunging into chaos blindly?" Ned leveled a gaze at the dwarf. "For now, Lord Tyrion, you remain free, but do not test my resolve." Tyrion gave a short, mocking bow and stepped aside. He was too clever to incite further conflict right then. Securing the Lannister royals in the dungeons did not feel like a victory to Ned. It felt like an ominous first step in a journey he could not see the end of. With Robert dead by his hand and the Lannisters subdued, the realm was poised on the edge of a sword. Renly Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon would soon hear of what had transpired. Each would have his own ambition. The Tyrells and Martells would weigh their loyalties. The Greyjoys might see an opportunity for independence. Far in the east, Daenerys Targaryen might sense a chance to reclaim the throne of her forebears if she learned how precarious the situation in Westeros had become. The alliances that Robert had once held together with feasts and tourneys now sat in tatters. Ned stood at the heart of it all, the man who had once only wanted to protect his family and keep the North secure. By late evening, the city boiled with rumors. Some claimed Ned had usurped the throne. Others said Joffrey was a bastard. Still others whispered that Robert had not died of his wounds but was murdered. Dread coiled in Ned's stomach at the last rumor, for it was true, though only he and the gods knew the exact nature of it. The thought made him want to retch. He withdrew to the solar once used by the king's hand, a place that still bore remnants of the man Robert once was. The map of the Seven Kingdoms lay across a large table, figurines representing houses scattered over its surface. Ned stared at it, remembering a simpler time. He remembered the seeds of the rebellion, the fierce battles they had fought. He remembered how Robert had broken Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident. And now Robert was gone, by Ned's own deed. He felt tears prick his eyes, but he forced them away. Duty demanded he remain strong. The realm was leaderless, and every passing moment threatened to erupt into chaos. Across the city, his men were working to ensure that news of Joffrey's parentage spread in a controlled manner. He had summoned a handful of trusted maesters to confirm the black-haired lineage of all true Baratheons, to show how Joffrey's golden hair indicated a paternal link to Jaime. The evidence was clear enough to cast doubt upon the boy's legitimacy. But it was only a matter of time before word spread beyond the capital and demands were made for a great council or a war. When the door to the Solar opened, Ned looked up, expecting to see one of his captains. Instead, he found Arya. She slipped inside, her face streaked with dust and something like fury. "Father," she said in a shaky voice, "everyone's saying the Lannisters tried to kill you and that you've locked the Queen away. What's happening?" Ned's stern facade softened at the sight of his daughter. He opened his arms, and she rushed into them, trembling. He stroked her hair. "I'm sorry, little one. I tried to keep you safe from this madness." Arya pulled back, her gray eyes sharp as a cat's. "You always said that we must be honorable, that we serve justice. Is that what you're doing?" Ned's heart twisted. He remembered the monstrous act he had committed, unknown to his daughter. How could he reconcile that with the lessons he had taught her? He spoke carefully. "I am doing what I must to protect our family and the realm." It was the best he could manage without burdening her with the ugliness of what he had done. Arya searched his face, then nodded slowly, though she did not look entirely comforted. She turned and left without another word, the specter of war weighing heavily on her small shoulders. Ned spent a sleepless night drafting letters to the great houses of Westeros, explaining that Robert Baratheon had passed, that Prince Joffrey's legitimacy was in question, and that, until Stannis Baratheon arrived, Lord Eddard Stark would hold power as regent to preserve peace. He composed them with care, knowing that every word would be dissected by hungry lords looking for advantage. He sealed them with the Stark sigil and dispatched them by raven at dawn. This act alone sent shockwaves across the realm. Men who had once scorned Ned as a naive lord found themselves facing a new reality. The North was asserting control over the Iron Throne. Temporarily, perhaps, but such a position of power was unprecedented for House Stark. 3 days later, Stannis Baratheon's reply arrived. It was terse and characteristically cold. He did not acknowledge Ned's regency. He simply wrote that he was marching with troops toward King's Landing to claim his rightful seat. Ned expected no less. Stannis would want no caretaker on the throne. He would demand immediate loyalty. The question was, how would Renly react? The younger Baratheon brother had also gathered supporters, those who found Stannis's harsh demeanor unappealing and believed Renly, with his charm, would make a more beloved king. The Tyrells, swayed by Renly's marriage to Marjorie or some other arrangement, might throw their banners behind him. A storm brewed on the horizon, and Ned felt the first gusts. Within King's Landing, the people were torn. Some saw Ned as a hero who had exposed the Lannister treachery. Others reviled him as a traitor who had struck at the legitimate queen and crown prince. Food shortages loomed, and the threat of war cut off trade routes. Whispers of dark omens circulated through Flea Bottom. Riots began to break out at night. The City Watch, under Ned's partial control, tried to maintain order, but the tension was palpable. Every measure Ned took, issuing coin for bread, forcing wealthy merchants to distribute grain, was met with suspicion by those who believed the new regime was no better than the old. In the midst of it all, Ned pressed on, as a man walking through a nightmare of his own making, sustained only by the hope that if he could guide the realm through this crisis, perhaps he could atone for what he had done. Letters began arriving from various lords. Some pledged cautious support for Ned's regency, stating that they would wait to see how events unfolded. Others demanded immediate release of the Queen and Joffrey, decrying Ned's actions as an affront to the established order. Still others wrote asking for alliances, offering marriage pacts or trade agreements in exchange for favor under the new administration. It was a deluge of politics, and Ned had never felt comfortable swimming in such waters. He missed the straightforward world of the North, where the cold was an honest enemy and men's words were as unadorned as their winter cloaks. He established a provisional council, appointing a few lords who had shown him loyalty. He retained Varys, though he never fully trusted the Spider. He allowed Tyrion Lannister to move freely, hoping that the imp's reputed cleverness might be bent toward avoiding a war with the rest of House Lannister. But Tyrion offered little reassurance. His sardonic wit hinted that House Lannister would not remain idle while its matriarch and golden children languished in cells. Days stretched into weeks. Tension escalated as Stannis' fleet circled Dragonstone and began to move toward King's Landing. Renly's forces, reportedly mustered in Highgarden, threatened to cut off supply lines to the city if Ned did not relinquish power to Renly. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister gathered an army in the west, outraged by the imprisonment of his daughter and son. He sent no letters to Ned, but the threat of the Lannister host marching on King's Landing loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon. The city, lacking a true king on the throne, was the prize every faction sought. Throughout this precarious time, Ned's nights were haunted by the memory of Robert's final moments. He saw the king's eyes, wide with pain, as the dagger slipped between his ribs. He heard Robert's final rattling breath. He tasted the bitterness of that betrayal on his tongue. On some nights, he dreamed of the Tower of Joy, of Lyanna's plea, of the blood on her bed. The weight of broken promises pressed on him like a millstone. He would wake before dawn, drenched in sweat, and pace the floors until the sun rose. Word arrived at last that Stannis was 2 weeks away from King's Landing by land, leading a considerable host. A messenger from the Stormlands suggested that Stannis might arrive even sooner by sea if he sailed around the Crownlands. Ned had to make a choice. Would he open the gates for Stannis and hand him the city, or would he attempt to negotiate? Hardliners among Ned's advisors urged him to declare Stannis king outright, to peacefully hand over power and avoid another bloodbath. But Ned knew that as soon as Stannis took the throne, he would execute Cersei and Joffrey, and likely Jaime as well. He might also demand that Ned answer for the tumult in the city. And what of Renly's claim? That tension would remain unresolved. The realm might still descend into war. As if the realm needed more turmoil, fresh rumors arrived from across the narrow sea. Whispers reached King's Landing that Daenerys Targaryen, the last scion of the Targaryen line, had supposedly hatched dragons. Many scoffed, dismissing it as a sailor's tall tale. But others, remembering the old powers of House Targaryen, trembled at the possibility. A sense of dread suffused the capital, a collective recognition that this was no ordinary succession crisis. The stage was set for the realm to erupt in fire and blood. Ned's mind, already tormented, spiraled into deeper doubt. He felt cornered by forces larger than himself, larger even than the memory of Robert's rebellion. 1,000 times he regretted his impulsive act, the murder he had justified as mercy. Perhaps if he had allowed Robert to die naturally, or if he had revealed Cersei's secret earlier, or if he had done any number of things differently, they would not be perched on this precipice. But regret could not undo the past. It could only spur him to act differently in the present. Finally, he made a decision that would stun the court. Calling a great assembly in the throne room, he stood before the Iron Throne, never sitting upon it, for that would suggest he claimed it, and addressed the nobles, knights, and small folk representatives who had gathered. He spoke of the realm's peril, of the armies marching toward King's Landing. He spoke of the threat of famine and plague if the city was besieged. He spoke of the Targaryen rumor and the danger of a foreign invasion. He hammered home the point that the realm needed unity more than ever. Then, with a deep breath, he said, "I have come to realize that I cannot hold this seat and simultaneously protect the realm. It is not my place to wear the crown, nor to appoint a king on my own. But I can call for a great council, a gathering of all the great lords and ladies of Westeros, to determine the rightful heir by law, by evidence, and by the will of the realm. Let all who would claim the throne come to King's Landing under truce and present their case. Let the realm witness the truth. I, Eddard Stark, will abide by the council's decision. If the council names Stannis Baratheon, so be it. If it names Renly Baratheon, so be it. If, he paused, steeling himself, if, by some chance, the Targaryens return and the council deems them rightful heirs, so be it. But let there be no more bloodshed over a question that men alone cannot answer. Let us gather and let the gods judge. The hall erupted in noise. Some called him wise. Others called him weak. But the notion of a great council had precedent. Once, the realm had decided between Rhaenys Targaryen and Viserys Targaryen generations ago, though that memory was half forgotten. Ned pressed on, dictating that while the council convened, he would maintain the peace in King's Landing, that all claimants would be guaranteed safe conduct to the city, and that the people's grievances would be heard. Perhaps it was a naive plan. Perhaps it was the only plan that might avoid plunging the realm into the jaws of unending war. Over the next few days, ravens flew across Westeros, carrying Ned's proclamation. Many scoffed. Tywin Lannister considered it a trick to buy time. Stannis Baratheon likely viewed it as a further insult to his legal claim. Renly, with his charming smile, might seize the opportunity to present himself as a more affable king. And there was no telling if Daenerys Targaryen would even hear of it, let alone heed the invitation. But the message spread, and the common folk, weary of strife, latched onto it as a slender reed of hope. A great council was a safer option than a raging war that might tear the countryside apart. Cersei, locked in her cell, railed against the plan. She demanded a trial by combat for herself and her children. Joffrey, at times, howled that Ned should be killed. At other times, he sobbed in terror. Jaime, sullen and defiant, refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, but at least he kept his scorn silent. Ned had assigned them guards who would not mistreat them, determined to keep his vow that they would be treated with some measure of dignity until they faced judgment. Tyrion Lannister petitioned daily for his family's release, trying every form of persuasion. But Ned remained unmoved. He could not simply free the Lannisters, not unless he wanted Tywin's armies to swarm the city. In truth, Tywin might attempt that anyway, but at least while Cersei, Jaime, and Joffrey were captives, the Lannisters might hesitate to launch a full-scale assault for fear of losing their blood. As the days dragged on, rumors circulated of Stannis halting his advance, uncertain how to respond to this great council invitation. Renly, too, paused at Highgarden, unsure if the Tyrells might gain more by negotiation than by open war. The tension was far from over, but for the moment, King's Landing was spared the immediate horrors of siege. Meanwhile, the old guilt festered in Ned's heart. Each day he sat in the small council chamber, mediating disputes and attempting to prepare the city for a possible influx of lords or an outbreak of war. Each night he returned to the solar or to his bedchamber, feeling Lyanna's reproachful eyes and Robert's final gasp in his dreams. He had unleashed a chain of events that might only end in cataclysm, or might, just might, end in a fragile peace hammered out by the lords of the realm. He thought back to his father and brother, who had died in the very city he now ruled over in Robert's name. He wondered if they would recognize the man he had become. He wondered if they would condemn him, or if they would see the necessity that burned beneath his decisions. Sansa Stark, who had once believed in the fairy tale of being Joffrey's queen, now avoided him. She could not forgive the imprisonment of the boy she had convinced herself she loved. She wept and pleaded for Joffrey's release, unable to understand the deeper politics at play. Ned tried to comfort her, but she turned away, bitterness clouding her youthful face. Arya, for her part, remained at her father's side, angry and confused, but determined to learn the sword. Ned promised to keep her safe, though he wished for her a childhood unburdened by war. In the city, people began to refer to Ned as the Lord Regent, some with scorn, some with cautious respect. The power he wielded was immense, yet intangible, for it might vanish if one of the major claimants marched in with an overwhelming force. Streets buzzed with speculation about the Great Council, about the Lannisters' fate, about whether a new Targaryen might appear. Meanwhile, the faceless threat of the coming winter loomed. Already, there were signs that the seasons were turning. Darker nights, cooler winds from the north. The realm needed unity to brace for what was to come. Could Ned Stark, who had murdered a king and seized the city, truly guide them to that unity? Days turned into weeks, weeks into a month. The expected onslaught did not come immediately. Stannis, Renly, and Tywin all seemed locked in a stalemate of mistrust, each uncertain if the others would descend upon them if they made the first move. Letters arrived from Dorne, from the Vale, from the Riverlands, each expressing wariness yet willingness to consider a council if safety could be assured. Ned responded meticulously, offering hostages and neutral mediation if necessary. He realized that, in effect, he was attempting to hold a realm-wide peace conference. Could it truly work? In quiet moments, Ned allowed himself a sliver of hope. Perhaps this was the realm's best chance to avoid another war that would turn fields to ashes and feed carrion crows with the corpses of the smallfolk. Perhaps his act of murder, vile though it was, had sparked a new path, a path that relied on a collective decision rather than the whims of a single monarch. Yet he also knew that men like Tywin Lannister or Walder Frey would only abide by a council's decision if it suited their interests. Power was rarely relinquished out of respect for law or tradition. Still, Ned pressed on. He mustered the city's defenses, built up food stores, and attempted to mediate smaller disputes among the nobles who had already arrived in the capital, hoping to influence the future of the throne. Each day, he sat in the throne room without sitting on the Iron Throne, hearing petitions and complaints. It was a grueling, thankless task, but in it, he found a sense of purpose. Here, at least, he could do some measure of good, protect the innocent, ensure fair judgments, things the realm had lacked under Robert's negligence. Of course, not everyone agreed with Ned's methods. Some whispered that he was an unfit regent, that he had no right to hold the city. Others complained that the North was exerting undue influence over the rest of the kingdoms. But as the weeks passed and no massive armies burned through the countryside, some grudgingly admitted that Ned's approach was preferable to open warfare. One evening, after a long day of managing disputes, Ned retired to his chambers. He found himself unable to rest. He paced the length of the room, trying to quell the turmoil inside him. At last, he sank to his knees and prayed, though he did not know to which gods. He prayed for deliverance for the realm, for forgiveness for his sin, for the chance that his children might know peace. The memory of Robert's last breath would never leave him, but he clung to the possibility that some greater good might emerge from his darkest act. Days later, a raven arrived from Dragonstone. Stannis Baratheon had agreed to attend the Great Council under the condition that he be allowed to arrive with 1,000 men to ensure his safety. Ned agreed, though the city might not handle 1,000 men comfortably, and tensions would be high. Another raven arrived from Renly, stating that he too would come, with the support of the Tyrells. The tides of fate were swelling, converging on King's Landing. Soon, the city would be host to the principal claimants, each with their own armies nearby, each with their own agenda. War or peace or something in between hung in the balance. Ned thought of the words of the oath he had sworn so many years ago. Winter is coming. He had repeated them countless times, a reminder to stay vigilant, to prepare for hardship. Never had they felt more true. Winter was coming both literally and figuratively, for the realm was on the cusp of a great trial. And in that trial, Eddard Stark, the man who had once cherished honor above all, stood as the reluctant regent, carrying the secret of a king's murder in his heart. Perhaps in the forging of a new order, his sin would be dwarfed by the realm's salvation. Or perhaps the cost of that sin would claim him before peace could ever take root. But as the dawn rose over King's Landing, gilding the city's towers in pale light, Ned reminded himself that he was still standing, and so was the realm, trembling, fragile, but not yet broken. There was still a chance to steer it from the brink, to guide it toward a fairer future. If it cost him his life or even his soul, he would try. For better or worse, that was the path he had chosen when he plunged the dagger into Robert's chest. He would carry the weight of that choice to the end, whether it brought him to glory or ruin. And in the meantime, the realm waited, breath held, for the shape of things to come. As the dawn rose over King's Landing, pale light etched the rooftops of the city into vivid relief, touching each spire and parapet with a fleeting glimmer of gold. Eddard Stark, Lord Regent, some now called him, stood alone on a high balcony that jutted from Maegor's Holdfast, gazing over the awakening city. He had not slept. Sleep had become a luxury he could ill afford. His eyes were gritty, shot through with red veins, and the lines in his face seemed deeper than ever. Yet he remained stoic, hands folded on the stone balustrade, as the first caw of gulls sounded along the Blackwater. A swirl of conflicting emotions seized him. The guilt of King Robert Baratheon's death lay on him like a chain of iron links, unbreakable, unyielding. He remembered that terrible moment when he had slid the dagger home, half convincing himself it was a mercy, half fearing it was murder, and wholly knowing it was both. Since then, he had tried to find some measure of atonement by holding the realm together, calling for a great council, halting a war that threatened to consume the Seven Kingdoms in a tide of blood. Perhaps this was how the gods punished him, by forcing him to rule in the place of the friend he had betrayed. He closed his eyes, recalling Robert's once booming laugh when they were young and full of fire. The memory stung like salt on an open wound. Exhaling, he looked down into the courtyard below. Small folk bustled among the stalls, and some of his own guards patrolled the outer wards. That was his duty now, to keep the peace until the realm could gather and decide upon its future. He prayed each day that the lords would heed his call for a great council rather than answer the clarion of war. He turned to go inside, already dreading the day's tasks. The Red Keep was stirring, and with it came a new deluge of petitioners, courtiers, and supplicants. He was not surprised to see Varys waiting just inside the solar, hands folded together in a gesture of polite concern. "My lord," said the master of whisperers, inclining his shaved head, "the morning brings new tidings." Ned regarded the man warily. He had never fully trusted Varys, though he recognized that the eunuch's knowledge could be a boon if carefully wielded. "Speak." Varys let out a soft sigh. "The city seethes. The merchants grow restless with trade lines so uncertain. The highborn lords who have answered your invitation gather in uneasy clusters, each suspecting the other of intrigue. Word of the Lannisters' imprisonment has reached as far as Sunspear, and Prince Doran Martell is said to be angry," Ned finished. Dorne had reasons to resent the Lannisters and the throne itself, given the fates of Elia Martell and her children, but unpredictably, that same anger might be aimed at any occupying power. "What else?" Varys paused, folding his hands more tightly. "A caravan has arrived in the city under the sigil of House Tyrell, apparently an advance party. Mace Tyrell has not come himself, but his envoys are here to prepare lodgings for Lord Renly Baratheon and his retinue." Renly Baratheon, the younger brother. Even as Ned had dreaded Stannis' approach, he knew that Renly was every bit as much a claimant to the throne, if not by law, then by the fickle favor of certain lords. "How many are they?" "Only a dozen at present," Varys replied. "Though rumor says Renly's main force remains near the Rose Road, a day or two's march away. They want to ensure a safe welcome in the city." Ned gave a faint nod. "We will offer them safe conduct as promised. And if they try to incite conflict, we'll—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not want to say that they would quell any uprising by force if they had to. But that was the reality. Ned had spent his life shunning politics and war whenever possible, yet now he sat at the precarious center of them both. Varys's lips curled into a careful smile. "A wise course, my lord. Also, I have been informed that Stannis Baratheon is en route by sea, commanding a fleet that left Dragonstone 2 days past. The timing may coincide quite dramatically with Lord Renly's arrival." So Ned thought the Baratheon brothers converge on King's Landing, each demanding the crown. It was the scenario he had both expected and dreaded. Then we must be certain the city is prepared to host them both, and that no man draws steel until this council can convene. "Just so," said Varys, inclining his head again. I shall leave you to make the necessary arrangements. The people will look to you as a guiding light, my lord." Ned grunted. He felt no lightness, guiding or otherwise. It was as though he wore a suit of armor made of lead. Every choice pressed down on him, and he wondered if some part of him, some pride or fear, had driven him to murder Robert just to seize control in a misguided attempt at saving the realm. But there was no time to reflect further. Duties called. He left the Solar, instructing one of his captains to gather a small contingent of City Watch to escort the Tyrell envoys. Another servant arrived, breathless, to say that two lords were brawling in the courtyard over a contested piece of land in the Stormlands, each believing Ned would favor him if he put on a good show of force. Ned sighed, already picturing the day's endless string of headaches. He handled the minor crises one by one, summoning the brawling lords to a lesser audience hall. Ser Meryn Trant of the Kingsguard, still in the Red Keep only by Ned's tolerance, stood with arms folded as the lords flung insults at each other. Ned managed to pry out the facts. Both men claimed a plot of land near the Wendwater. In times past, they would have taken the matter to Stannis as Lord of Dragonstone or to Robert as king. Now, with the realm in flux, they had come to Ned. After an hour of heated argument, Ned assigned the land's oversight to a third party until the Great Council could settle such disputes. Neither lord was pleased, but both accepted. Such was the shape of his days. Bridging rifts, issuing partial judgments, and preparing the capital for what felt like an oncoming storm. Each candlemark that passed brought new rumors of armies on the march, new threats from distant lords. Yet, ironically, the city had not yet collapsed into panic. Ned's call for a great council, combined with the uncharacteristic stalemate among the major powers, had bought everyone a fragile peace. For how long, he could not say. That evening, he convened his council, or what passed for it. Seated around a long table in a private chamber were Varys, of course, Grand Maester Pycelle, who had regained some composure after the shock of Robert's death, Ser Barristan Selmy, who served out of a sense of honor rather than loyalty to any particular claimant, Tyrion Lannister, who sat with cautious curiosity, though Ned had not yet determined why he allowed the imp so close to power, and a handful of lesser lords who had pledged neutrality until the Great Council was held. Peter Baelish was notably absent once more, having vanished after the failed attempt to swing the City Watch in Cersei's favor. Some said he had fled King's Landing altogether. Others claimed he lurked in the city's underbelly, waiting for the right moment to reappear. Ned cleared his throat, ignoring the tension that flitted around the table. "We have word that Renly and Stannis will arrive within days, possibly on the same day. We must ensure they do not clash in the streets. Any ideas?" Tyrion tapped a finger on the table, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "You could always host a grand feast and seat them on opposite ends of the hall with armed guards between, like dogs who mustn't see each other until the master says so." Pycelle bristled. "We are talking about the potential kings of Westeros, my lord, not dogs." "Apologies," Tyrion said, not sounding particularly contrite. "But it's near enough the same principle. If either brother sees the other as a threat, they'll snap at each other's throats before they bother to assess the situation." Barristan Selmy's somber voice cut in. "They must both be made to swear, on their honor as Baratheons and as men, that they will abide by the peace of this great council. If one draws steel, he is forsworn." Ned rubbed his brow. "Stannis will be more likely to keep such an oath. Renly." He trailed off, recalling the younger man's charismatic but impulsive nature. "Let us hope he sees sense. Still, it's not enough to rely on their honor. We need a plan if, gods forbid, they try to settle their claims by violence." Ser Barristan inclined his head. "We can position the City Watch throughout the streets, with orders to disarm any soldiers who dare raise steel. Barricade certain routes so that Renly's and Stannis's men cannot easily intersect. If they approach from different gates, we keep them separated until each has been received within the Red Keep." Varys nodded, the folds of his silken robes rustling. "A prudent arrangement, my lord, though we must also consider how to greet them within the keep. They will both wish to speak with you immediately, claim the throne for themselves, and demand the submission of all present." Ned exhaled slowly. Then we will greet them in the throne room, but we will not let their forces inside the keep itself. Only a small honor guard each. The rest can camp outside the city walls or in designated barracks. Once inside, we escort them to separate wings. No good can come of them meeting face to face until the Great Council is fully convened. Yes, Tyrion murmured. And in the meantime, we hold the Lannisters captive to ensure Tywin doesn't decide to storm the city. Such a pleasant tapestry you've woven, Lord Stark. Ned fixed Tyrion with a hard look. If Tywin doesn't like it, he can attend the council himself and argue for his grandchildren's claim. Tyrion folded his hands. Oh, he likes it not at all, I assure you. But you hold all three. A queen, a prince, and a kingslayer. A trifecta of hostages too precious for him to risk losing in a direct assault. He might bide his time or plan something less frontal. A hush fell in the chamber. Each man there sensed the truth in Tyrion's words. Tywin Lannister was not known for meekly accepting defeat. He would strike eventually at a time and place of his choosing. Until then, he might appear quiescent, but no one believed that ruse. Ned squared his shoulders. That is our plan, then. Separate receptions for Stannis and Renly. Peace enforced by the City Watch. A great council as soon as possible. We will publicly declare that any man who raises arms before the council's conclusion is committing treason against the realm, punishable by death. Barristan inclined his head, Pycelle murmured approval, and Varys offered a shallow bow. Tyrion simply rubbed his chin, no doubt imagining the multiple ways such a plan could go awry. Meeting dismissed, said Ned, feeling the weight of his position pressing down. As they filed out, Tyrion lingered behind, as if wanting a private word. Ned regarded the imp with guarded curiosity. Yes. Tyrion's sardonic smile slipped, replaced by something more grave. Lord Stark, I'll not pretend I'm happy with my family in your dungeons, but I'm not entirely blind to reason either. My sister has overplayed her hand more than once. Jaime, for all his skill, is no diplomat. And Joffrey, well, let us say he does not win hearts with ease. Ned kept silent, unsure of Tyrion's motives. With that in mind, Tyrion continued, I appreciate that you have not ordered their executions. Others might have done so, hoping to rid themselves of the Lannister threat once and for all. The realm's memory can be alarmingly short, after all. Ned's voice was flat. I do not butcher captives. Nor do you butcher kings, Tyrion quipped, then paused, eyes flicking quickly to Ned's face. Or so the official story goes. Ned's heart clenched, but he forced his expression not to change. Robert died of his wounds from the boar hunt. Tyrion's head tilted slightly, as if in acknowledgement of the official narrative. Ah, indeed. Nonetheless, I wanted to say that I, too, am no monster. I have the ear of certain sellswords, certain cunning men, who might attempt to free my siblings. But I've counseled them otherwise. He paused, letting that sink in. For now, Ned struggled not to bristle at the thinly veiled threat. I see. If the council should decide in favor of my nephew, an unlikely scenario, I grant you. And if you remain open to negotiation, it would be wise for all of us to keep lines of communication free from bloodshed. We cannot know what madness may unfold once the Baratheon brothers arrive. Ned folded his arms. You want me to spare your family in any case, or to cut a deal? Tyrion's shrug was almost helpless. I want them alive, yes. As for a deal, well, I have no illusions about Joffrey's likelihood of winning the throne in the Great Council. But if that day should come to pass, or if we come to some lesser arrangement, I'd prefer not to see King's Landing drowned in gore. Ned realized then that Tyrion, perhaps more than any Lannister in the city, saw how precarious the situation was. I'll not promise anything beyond a fair hearing and their safety, so long as no Lannister attempts to free them by stealth or force. Tyrion dipped his head. Fair enough. Without another word, the imp departed. Ned stood there a while, tension knotting his shoulders. He wished he could simply banish all Lannisters from his sight, but the realm was not so simple. House Lannister's power was vast, and their gold minted half the coin used throughout Westeros. The realm could not be stable if the West rose in open rebellion. He left the chamber, heading for a secluded corridor that led to the dungeons. It had become his grim habit to visit the cells on occasion, ensuring the prisoners were treated according to his orders. The Red Keep cells were dank, but better than the dreaded black cells. He had placed Jaime and Joffrey each in a small separate chamber, albeit with some comfort. Cersei occupied a slightly larger cell with a private chamber pot and a single window set high in the stone. Guards stood at each door. The corridor smelled of damp straw and stale sweat. The gloom pressed in like a living thing. Ned nodded to the guards, then stopped first at Jaime's cell. Through the iron bars, he saw the Kingslayer seated on a bench, arms crossed, hair tangled. He looked up sharply at the sound of footsteps. "Come to gloat, Stark?" Jaime asked in a low, dangerous voice. Ned's grip tightened on the torch. "I'm here to ensure you are treated fairly." Jaime gave a short, humorless laugh. "Fairly? How noble of you." Ned glanced at the stale bread and half-eaten bowl of stew on a small table. "Have they withheld food?" "No," Jaime said. "It's just not to my taste." His gaze flicked up, a shadow of the old arrogance shining there. "When will you release me?" "When the council decides your fate or when war forces my hand," Ned replied bluntly. Jaime's jaw clenched, and for a heartbeat Ned saw the rage simmering beneath. This was a man who lived by the sword and boasted of his skill. Imprisonment must be a personal hell for him. "I fought with Robert," Ned said, "and we brought down a king together. Now his brothers gather to claim his seat. I do not want another bloodbath, but the realm teeters on the edge. Don't make it worse." A bitter sneer twisted Jaime's lips. "So that's the speech you tell yourself, is it? That you're preserving the realm? And what of Robert's cub, Joffrey? If you were truly for the good of the realm, you'd have recognized that the boy is rightful king." "He is not Robert's son," Ned said quietly, "and you know it." Jaime's eyes flashed with a mixture of shame and defiance. "He was Robert's in name if not in blood. That's all that matters in this game." Ned shook his head. "Blood matters in the laws of succession, or we descend into chaos. You know better than that, Lannister." Jaime's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. Ned turned away, leaving the cell behind. Outside, in the corridor, the guard unlatched the next door. Joffrey's cell was smaller, but Ned had given the boy a decent bed and lamp. He found the former prince and self-styled king, curled in a corner, arms locked around his knees. The moment Joffrey saw Ned, he scrambled upright, trying to muster a princely air. "How dare you keep me here?" Joffrey's voice cracked. "I am the king. You are under suspicion," Ned interrupted, though it wrenched him inside to see the boy so undone. Joffrey was only a child, albeit a cruel one. "Have you been fed? Do you have everything you need?" Joffrey glared. "I need my sword, my mother free, and your head on a pike. I'll have all three soon enough, you northern dog." Ned felt a twinge of pity, despite the venom. "You'll remain here until the Great Council. If you behave, you'll be treated well." Joffrey spat on the floor. Ned sighed. There was little else to say, so he turned and left. The last cell, larger and only slightly less dreary, belonged to Cersei. She lay on the small cot, golden hair brushed meticulously as if to defy her surroundings. When she heard the iron door open, she lifted her chin. "Lord Stark," she greeted, voice as cold as the narrow window's breeze. "Come to relish my humiliation?" "I come to ensure the guards follow my orders," said Ned. "You're to be kept in safety." She laughed, the sound brittle. "Ironic, isn't it, that you keep me in this cell under the pretense of safety?" "Better this than the alternative," Ned said. "Many in the city wanted your head. They say you and Jaime were responsible for murdering Jon Arryn and for fathering false heirs on the throne. They say you're a traitor to the realm." Her eyes glowed with anger. "People believe any rumor that suits them. But yes, I fathered children by Jaime. And why not? Robert cared nothing for me. He'd sooner bed whores and drown himself in wine. Tell me, Stark, Was his last hour as ignoble as the rest of his life? Ned went rigid, remembering all too well how Robert's last hour truly ended. "He died in the manner of a king," was all he could say, voice tight. Cersei's lips curved, sensing a nerve. "Oh yes, a valiant boar, a mighty hunt. The worst-kept secret is that it was no mere accident. Perhaps you know more about that, Eddard Stark." A chill swept over him, but he kept his features stern. "You speak in riddles. Rest assured, if you value your life, you'll remain here quietly until the Great Council." She sat up, crossing her arms. "And what of me if the council decides to enthrone Stannis? He'll have my head. My children's too." Ned set his jaw. "If the council condemns you, you'll have a trial. The realm is not lawless. All the more reason to remain peaceful." Her laughter was as hard as steel. "Peaceful? While you strip my son of his birthright, hold my brother in chains, and threaten to hand me over to the man who hates me most. You are a cold fool, Stark." "I'm trying to prevent war," he said, but already he felt the hollowness of the words. He had murdered the king she'd betrayed. There was no going back. "We're done here," he finished stiffly. He left her cell and climbed the winding stairs back to the courtyard, struggling to rid himself of the heavy dread that clung to his every step. He found Arya in the yard, practicing footwork with a wooden sword, her small face set in concentration. Syrio Farrell was gone. Ned had neither the time nor the resources to keep the Braavosi hired once the city became a tinderbox. Now, an old Northman guardsman instructed her in the basics. Ned paused at the edge, observing. Despite his own turmoil, a small flicker of pride touched him as Arya danced around, jabbing and feinting. She was resilient and determined, even in the gloom of King's Landing. She noticed him, lowered her practiced sword, and came running. "Father!" Her cheeks were flushed with exercise. "They say Renly's banner has been spotted near the Gate of the Gods. Is it true? Is there going to be a battle?" He laid a hand on her head. "No battle if I can help it. Lord Renly is to be welcomed peacefully. We must ensure all parties arrive safely for the council." She frowned. "But he wants the throne, doesn't he?" "Yes," Ned admitted. "He believes he can rule better than Stannis. We shall see who the realm chooses." Arya looked uneasy. "I heard some of the men say the realm should choose you. They say you've done more ruling than the rest of them combined." Ned gave her a sad smile. "I'm not fit to be king, nor do I wish to be. I only want to keep the peace. Remember that, Arya." She nodded, but the concern in her eyes lingered. "Will you be safe, father?" He touched her cheek gently. "I will do my best. Now go on, back to your training." She skipped away, practiced sword slapping her leg. Watching her, Ned felt a pang of longing for Winterfell, for a life far simpler than the one fate had thrust upon him. Later that afternoon, horns blared at the city walls, announcing a noble retinue approaching. Ned, accompanied by a dozen of his loyal gold cloaks, made his way to the main gate. The banners that approached were unmistakable, the golden rose of House Tyrell and the stag-and-rose sigil that Renly had adopted. Even from a distance, Ned saw the flash of bright armor and the swirl of green cloaks. Renly Baratheon had always fancied himself a king of summer, lavish and handsome, comfortable in the crowd's adoration. The city gates opened under strict instructions. Ned stood at attention with his men as Renly and his entourage entered. Leading the group on a fine white courser, Renly wore a suit of shining gold and green plate, a crown of golden antlers circling his dark hair. He looked every bit the bright young king, if such a thing could be conjured from a tapestry. The crowd that had gathered, small folk peering over the battlements, murmured in awe or suspicion. Behind Renly rode Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, equally resplendent in his ornate armor. The rest of the retinue included various Tyrell bannermen, minor lords from the Stormlands, and a train of supplies. They entered the city in a clatter of hooves, and Renly halted before Ned, removing his gauntlet to reveal a ring on his finger, a ring set with an emerald that sparkled in the sun. "Lord Stark," Renly called in a clear voice. I come to King's Landing by your invitation to present my claim before the Great Council. Ned inclined his head, resisting the urge to bow. Welcome, Lord Renly. In the name of King's Landing, I extend you safe conduct. You and your immediate guard are free to enter the Red Keep. The rest of your force, however, must camp outside the city walls to keep the peace. Renly's face revealed only a flicker of displeasure. Then he smiled, all courtly charm. Of course, Lord Regent, we shall abide by your terms. A faint hush fell as Ned's men escorted them inward. Renly dismounted, pressing a flamboyant kiss to the back of Margaery Tyrell's hand, who stood by the caravan. She was dressed in a gown of pale green, her face serene and poised. Ned found himself thinking that she, too, had the look of someone accustomed to playing a grand role. "Where shall I lodge?" Renly asked, stepping beside Ned as they walked up the main thoroughfare. "In the Red Keep, as I said, for you and a small retinue," Ned explained. "We've prepared chambers in Maegor's Holdfast, near the royal apartments." Renly's eyebrows lifted. "How generous! And what of the Iron Throne?" Ned kept his voice neutral. "It remains empty, awaiting the realm's decision. Until the council convenes, I hold regency to keep order." Renly cast a sidelong glance. "Order indeed. I hear you're holding my late brother's queen and children captive. You might call that order. I might call it something else." Ned's step faltered, but he recovered. "They are suspected of treason. The council will decide their fate as well." Renly's mouth twisted slightly. "So be it. The truth will out. Stannis may cry about the law, but I have the love of the people. The realm needs a king who can unite them, not freeze them out with a clenched jaw." Ned said nothing. He led Renly and his guard through the gates of the Red Keep. The gold cloaks on duty stood at attention, and once inside, stewards hurried to help stable the horses and store the baggage. Loras Tyrell dismounted and walked gracefully alongside Margaery, while other knights of the Reach cast appreciative looks at the splendid architecture of the castle. Their immediate lodgings were a set of chambers once used for visiting royalty, situated along a gallery that offered a sweeping view of Blackwater Bay. Renly looked about, nodded approval, and gave Ned a courteous bow. "Well, Lord Stark, I shall rest from my journey. We can discuss the details of this council soon." Ned bowed in return stiffly. "You know where to find me." Renly smirked and turned away, leading his party inside. As Ned departed, he could hear Loras Tyrell's low voice speaking to Margaery about keeping up appearances, though the words were muffled by the thick walls. Ned's instincts told him the Tyrells would be maneuvering behind the scenes, forging alliances to strengthen Renly's claim. He wondered if Stannis would arrive in time or come too late. He did not have to wonder long. Within a day, King's Landing was abuzz with the news that sails bearing the fiery heart of Stannis Baratheon had appeared in the waters off Driftmark. A fleet of war galleys and cogs was heading straight for the Blackwater Rush. The city braced itself, uncertain whether to cheer or cower, for Stannis was not known for his pageantry, nor for his mercy. He would appear at the city's gates demanding recognition as king by right of law. Ned stood on the ramparts along the harbor at dawn, watching the approach of Stannis' ships. The wind off the water held a briny bite. Soldiers lined the docks below, their spears bristling. The few city ships that remained prepared to cede the Blackwater to Stannis' fleet. Ned could almost taste the tension. When the ships drew near, a single galley under a banner of truce rowed forward. A lean figure stood at the prow, Stannis himself, wearing a thick cloak pinned at the shoulder by the Baratheon stag. Ned ordered the harbor gates opened, and with a small guard, he went to meet the rowboat as it docked. The scraping of oars along the timbers echoed in the hush. Stannis Baratheon stepped onto the pier, his jaw set in granite, his eyes cold as winter ice. Behind him came a handful of household guards bearing the standard of the crowned stag atop a red heart. He regarded Ned with a rigid nod. "Lord Stark." Ned inclined his head. "Lord Stannis, welcome to King's Landing." Stannis' lip curled. "My brother once welcomed me to these docks. Then he grew fat on the throne he stole from the Targaryens." Now he's dead, and the realm is in chaos. Ned kept his voice level. I called for a great council to settle that chaos. You are here to present your claim. I do not present a claim, Stannis said in a voice like chipped stone. I am the king. I come to demand fealty from you and from all lords who cling to illusions. My brother's children are bastards, fruit of an incestuous union. The throne is mine, by law and by blood. A ripple of unease passed among the gathered men. Ned lifted a hand in a calming gesture. Your claim is strong, but others also claim the throne, including your younger brother, who arrived just yesterday. For the sake of the realm, we ask that you submit to the will of the Great Council and— Stannis snorted, his gauntlet hand flexing at his side. Renly is no better than the Lannisters, crowning himself while the rightful heir lives. If he does not stand down, I will destroy him. Is that what you want, Stark? Another field of corpses. While winter looms, Ned's face tightened. Of course not. I want peace. Stannis's gaze swept across the harbor, as if searching for some sign of treachery. Then command Renly to bend the knee and let us end this charade. If he yields, I will spare his life, though I have no love for traitors. Otherwise, my men will see to it that he never leaves this city. Ned's voice grew steel in it. You will not start a war in King's Landing. The City Watch will prevent any bloodshed. We have agreed to a truce until the council meets. Stannis stared at him as if he were a stubborn child. Truce? While the rightful king stands outside the walls. By what authority do you dictate terms to me? Ned felt a flash of anger, remembering all too well the nights he had spent risking his life and his soul to preserve the realm for men like Stannis. I do so as the Lord Regent of the city, by the authority of the realm's need for stability. You are welcome to enter under truce, or you can try to storm the walls. But if you choose the latter, you'll be attacking not just me, but every lord who has come to see this council through. Stannis's lips pressed into a thin line, the cords in his neck standing out. The tension was almost tangible. Then, after a long moment, he spoke. Very well. I have no desire to spill blood if it can be spared. I will ride into the city with a token force. The rest of my men will wait across the river. But let us be plain, Stark. My patience is not infinite. I will give this council a short while to recognize my claim, or else the city will taste steel and fire. Ned gave a terse nod, relief and dread mingling in equal measure. Understood. They led Stannis and his chosen guard into the Red Keep with all due caution. Barristan Selmy had the forethought to line the route with loyal gold cloaks, ensuring that Stannis's men remained outnumbered if tempers flared. Yet the arrival was subdued, no cheering crowds, no pageantry. Stannis seemed to prefer it that way, marching through the castle corridors like a stern commander inspecting a fortress. Ned had prepared a set of chambers for Stannis that mirrored those he had given Renly, on the opposite side of the castle. He delivered Stannis there, ignoring the man's curt demeanor. You'll find all you need within. The council will convene as soon as the remaining lords arrive. Stannis's voice was clipped. See that it does, and see that my brother does not attempt some deceitful trick. If we cross paths in the corridors, do not hold me accountable for the outcome. With that ominous note, Ned left him. His mind spun. Both Baratheon brothers had arrived, each refusing to yield an inch. It was an uneasy standoff, and Ned's gut told him it would not hold for long. That evening, Ned convened another gathering of his provisional council, this time with Renly and Stannis themselves in attendance, but in separate sessions. Each brother demanded to speak privately, to present his case to Ned and the other lords who oversaw the city's security. In the interest of neutrality, Ned arranged to meet Stannis first, then Renly in the same council chamber, with a recess in between to ensure they did not cross paths. Stannis arrived accompanied by a grizzled knight named Ser Davos Seaworth, who Ned knew by reputation as the Onion Knight, once a smuggler, now Stannis's loyal man. Renly arrived with Loras Tyrell and Margaery. The tension in each meeting was palpable. Stannis's meeting began with him standing at the head of the table, arms crossed over his armored chest. "I want an immediate trial for Cersei Lannister and her children," he announced. "They are traitors and pretenders. If the council finds them guilty, and it will, then their heads are forfeit. Let the realm see that we do not abide false heirs." Ned answered with the measured calm he had learned to maintain. "A trial will be held, but not until the council is complete. Many lords have yet to arrive. We cannot pass final judgment without them." Stannis' scowl deepened. "Each day they live is an insult to the memory of my brother. And each day Renly struts about with his false crown is an insult to the laws of inheritance." Across the table, Tyrion Lannister, who attended as a silent observer, maintained a neutral mask. Varys merely steepled his fingers. Barristan Selmy stood rigidly. Grand Maester Pycelle nodded in vague agreement with Ned, but said nothing. Ser Davos cleared his throat. "My lord, it may be wise to show patience. There are many lords who still question the truth of Joffrey's parentage. They need time to see the evidence to be convinced beyond doubt. Rushing to execute him now might sow more dissent." Stannis shot Davos a glare, but said nothing. Ned felt a flicker of gratitude for the Onion Knight's measured counsel. After that, Stannis spent the remainder of the session demanding schedules, procedures for the council, and clarifications on who would judge the proceedings. Ned explained, as calmly as he could, that the council would be composed of all major lords and their designated representatives. They would hear evidence, compare genealogies, and decide who wore the crown. The entire discussion had an air of unreality, as if they were hashing out the rules of a tournament instead of the fate of the realm. When Stannis finally left, his expression was a thundercloud. Ned braced himself for the next wave. Renly. Indeed, not an hour later, Renly strolled in wearing a confident grin, accompanied by Loras Tyrell in polished armor and Marjorie in a gown of green silk. His manner was more convivial than Stannis's, but his demands were no less absolute. "Lord Stark," Renly said with a bow, "I appreciate that you've kept my dear brother away from me. I assume his mood was as pleasant as ever." Ned kept his features schooled. "He wants a swift trial and an immediate coronation. He deems your claim invalid by right of law." Renly laughed lightly, moving to seat himself at the table. "He would cling to that. I stand by my conviction that the people need a king they can love. The law can be twisted 1,000 ways. My claim may not be by strict primogeniture, but it's the best chance for peace." Marjorie placed a gentle hand on Renly's shoulder. "My lord believes the realm will see the wisdom in backing a king who can unite great houses, rather than a grim caretaker. House Tyrell stands behind him wholeheartedly." Loras Tyrell's eyes flicked to Ned, as if daring him to object. "King Renly will ensure prosperity. Stannis has never been beloved. He rules with fear and severity." Ned tapped the table with 2 fingers. "Your brother's claim is strong, Lord Renly, no matter how you frame it. I cannot declare you king on the basis of popularity alone. That is the council's role." Renly's expression tightened. "Then let the council meet now. Why delay? We are here, and I presume the lords loyal to Stannis are near, as well as the rest of the realm's lords who matter." Ned explained, again, that many lords were on the road, some from as far as the Eyrie and the Vale, others from Dorne, some from the north under Robb Stark's leadership. Renly scoffed. "Your son leading the north? Why not? Let him come if he will. The sooner all gather, the sooner we can crown a rightful king." There was a tension beneath Renly's easy manner, though. Ned sensed that he, too, was anxious about the possibility of Stannis attacking or launching a coup. However, Renly hid those fears behind a polished smile. As he escorted them out, Ned caught Marjorie's eye. She offered a demure nod, but her gaze was sharp. The Tyrell rose was no meek flower. House Tyrell's wealth and armies might tip the balance in Renly's favor if it came to a vote. But Stannis would not simply bow to that. Would the Great Council be decided by ballots, by bargains, or by swords drawn in the night? In the following days, King's Landing bristled with tension. Patrols of gold cloaks roamed the streets, posted at every corner, ensuring that Renly's and Stannis's men kept their distance. Minor skirmishes were quickly quelled. Taverns rang with speculation, and heated arguments occasionally erupted into fistfights, each man calling the other's chosen king a traitor. Messengers streamed in daily. Doran Martell of Dorne sent word that he would not come in person but would dispatch his brother, Prince Oberyn Martell, to represent House Martell. The Ares lady Lisa Arryn refused to leave the Vale but sent a lesser lord in her stead. The Riverlands were in turmoil due to rumors of reaving by Lannister forces near the borders, but Edmure Tully promised to ride for King's Landing with a small retinue. Walder Frey sent a polite note that he would consider attending, which, from Lord Frey, was little more than an ambiguous shrug. All the while, Ned felt like a man juggling torches over a pit of wildfire. He lacked the cunning or ambition of Peter Baelish, and he lacked Robert's capacity to charm lords with feasts and indulgences. He attempted to be fair, to keep the city fed from the stockpiles he had seized from merchant warehouses, to ensure that the laws were enforced impartially. Yet each day he rose with the dread that one spark might set the entire situation ablaze. On the 5th day after Stannis' arrival, a hush fell over the Red Keep at midday when a raven arrived bearing a black wax seal. Ned recognized it as one of the special seals used in the far north. His heart quickened. It might be from Robb. He opened it in his solar, eyes scanning the parchment. The words were brief. "Father, we march south under the banner of the Direwolf to represent the North at your council. I bring with me the great lords sworn to House Stark. We do so peacefully, but we will not allow the North's voice to be ignored. Winter is coming. Robb." Ned read it twice, pride and trepidation roiling inside him. His son was but a youth, forced into the role of a leader by the chaos after Robert's death. And yet here he was, marching at the head of the Northern Lords to ensure their interests were not trampled. The letter brought both comfort. Ned would see his son again, and fear that so many armed men descending on King's Landing might provoke an explosion. Nevertheless, he sent a reply by Raven. "Robb, you are welcome. Come under truce, ensure your men remain disciplined. Do not let them spark a conflict with any other force in the area. This council is our best hope for peace. Father." He sealed it with the Stark sigil and dispatched the bird. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. He had not confided in Robb about the grim deed he'd done. No one but Ned himself knew that he had ended Robert's life with a dagger. Perhaps that secret would stay buried forever, or perhaps it would surface to condemn him. He exhaled slowly. A knock on the door startled him. Barristan Selmy entered, bowing stiffly. "My lord, there is a visitor from the west." Ned's heart lurched. "From Casterly Rock?" "No, a solitary messenger wearing the lion's sigil, but not from Lord Tywin. He brings a letter. Says it is from Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother." Ned stood. "Show him in." Barristan ushered in a gray-haired man in Lannister colors. The messenger knelt briefly, then extended a sealed parchment. "Lord Kevan Lannister sends his respects, my lord, and begs you read this missive. He awaits your reply at the Lion Gate outside the city." Ned broke the seal, eyes flitting over the contents. Kevan Lannister wrote in a measured tone, expressing concern for the welfare of Cersei, Jaime, and Joffrey. He politely requested they be handed over to his custody, ensuring that they would remain in seclusion at Casterly Rock until the council concluded. He offered vague promises that if Ned complied, Tywin might be inclined to keep the peace. If not, well, the letter implied that the Lannister host would not remain idle forever. Ned set the parchment aside, anger smoldering in his chest. This was a thinly veiled ultimatum, couched in polite words. He looked at the messenger. "Return to Lord Kevan and inform him that the Queen Mother, her brother, and her son remain in protective custody until the Great Council decides their fate. We will not release them to anyone. Once the council is complete, we shall see." The messenger paled, though he tried to hide it with a bow. "My lord, Lord Kevan respectfully entreats you to consider." "I have considered." Ned cut him off curtly. "My answer stands." Barristan escorted the messenger out. Ned sank into his seat, pinching the bridge of his nose. It was exactly as Tyrion had predicted. Tywin Lannister's kin were testing the waters, likely to see if they could retrieve their prized family members without a fight. When that failed, Tywin might take other measures. The day wore on. Ned oversaw another small council session at which Stannis refused to be seated in the same room as Renly, insisting on private audiences. Renly, for his part, demanded that he be allowed to parade through the city with his knights to show the small folk that he would be a king of splendor and generosity. Ned denied the request, not wanting to risk violence in the streets. Both sides fumed. Night fell, heavy and oppressively warm. Ned returned to his chambers, where Sansa and Arya waited. Sansa had grown quieter since Joffrey's imprisonment. She had not forgiven Ned for taking away her betrothed, no matter the reason. Arya perched on a window seat, stargazing with the restless energy of a caged direwolf. As Ned entered, both girls looked up. "How was the council, father?" Arya asked, her voice subdued. "Strained," he admitted. "Nothing's changed. It's as if we're all standing in a circle, waiting for someone else to move first." Sansa fiddled with the hem of her gown. If Joffrey is found guilty, does that mean he dies?" She spoke the question in a small, trembling voice. Ned looked at her with weary eyes. "It may come to that, or it may not. The council could vote for exile, or for the wall, or for something else. It's too soon to tell." She lowered her gaze, unshed tears glistening. "I know he can be cruel, but he was my prince." The heartbreak in her voice was genuine. She had woven so many fairy tales around Joffrey that the reality felt like a betrayal of her dreams. Ned approached, laying a hand gently on her shoulder. "Sansa, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." She said nothing, only stared at the floor. Arya, on the other hand, stood up, fists clenched as if preparing for a fight she could not name. The tension in the air was stifling. A distant horn call echoed through the night. Ned stiffened. Likely the gates were admitting some late-coming lord or messenger. The city never truly slept anymore. With a sigh, he kissed both daughters on the brow and bade them rest. Then he took a moment in solitude, removing his cloak and sitting by the window, gazing over the moonlit rooftops. He tried to quiet his thoughts, but they buzzed relentlessly. Tywin Lannister's next move, Stannis' impatience, Renly's ambition, the approach of Robb from the north, the Targaryen whispers from across the narrow sea. And overshadowing all of it, the memory of the moment he drove a dagger into Robert's chest, the press of steel through flesh, the final rattling breath of a man he had called brother. He stood abruptly, feeling suffocated. The shadows in the chamber felt too thick. Grabbing a lantern, he left, wandering through the corridors with no particular destination in mind. Guards saluted him, giving him a wide berth. Eventually, he found himself outside the castle's small godswood. By custom, it was nothing like the spacious godswood of Winterfell, but it offered a patch of greenery, a single weirwood with a carved face that was said to be centuries old. He pushed through the gate into the enclosed garden. Moonlight painted the grass in silver strokes, and a soft breeze stirred the leaves. The weirwood stood near a small reflecting pool. It was no heart tree of the north, but it would have to do. He approached, the hush of night broken only by his footsteps on the damp earth. Kneeling, he tried to pray, or at least to find some measure of solace. For a long while, he remained there, listening to his own breathing and the faint lap of water. He recalled the old ways of the north, the silent prayers offered to the old gods, the feel of the wind across the moors, the comfort of winter snows. In King's Landing's oppressive heat, with war on every horizon, that memory felt as distant as a dream. At last, he rose to leave, feeling no more certain than when he arrived. As he turned, he saw a figure standing near the garden's gate. Arya. She had followed him, silent as a cat. He started, heart lurching. "Arya? What are you doing here?" She stepped forward, brow furrowed. I wanted to see if you were all right. You never come here at night unless something's really bothering you." Ned forced a faint smile. "I'm fine, little one. Just thinking." She glanced at the weirwood. "They say the old gods watch through those faces. Do you believe that?" He considered the question, remembering the face carved into the heart tree in Winterfell. I once did. I still do, in my way. Arya approached, standing beside him. Do you ever talk to them about Robert? Or about what happened? His chest constricted. She meant the death of the king, of course, though she had no idea how intimately he was involved. I speak to them about many things, he said softly, praying they'll guide me. She looked up at him, eyes too wise for her age. I hope they do, because I'm scared, father. There are so many soldiers, so many lords. They all want to be king, and I don't understand it. I just want to go home. Ned's heart twisted. He placed a hand on her shoulder. I know, he murmured. I want that too, but we must do our duty first. Then, if the gods are good, we can return to Winterfell. Arya nodded, though tears shone in her eyes. Together, they left the Godswood, walking in silence through the shadowed corridors back to the living quarters. Ned escorted Arya to the chamber she shared with Sansa. He prayed she would find some rest, though he doubted he would. Morning came, ushered in by the clang of bells. Messengers arrived from a dozen roads, heralding the approach of lords from all corners of the realm. The Tullus from Riverrun, a delegation of Arryn loyalists from the Vale, and, most significantly, a large host of Northmen under Robb Stark's banner. The city stirred, uncertain whether to brace for a siege or to rejoice in the possibility that the council might finally convene. Ned stood on the walls overlooking the Rose Road, scanning the horizon. It was late afternoon when he saw the dust cloud indicating the northern host. At its forefront fluttered the direwolf banner of House Stark. His pulse quickened with a mixture of pride and apprehension. How large a force had Robb brought? If it was too big, it might provoke immediate hostility from the other claimants. As the army neared, Ned could see that it was formidable, thousands of men, with the sigils of various northern houses. Umber, Manderly, Karstark, and more. Yet they halted a league from the city walls, pitching tents in a wide field. Only a small group continued forward under a peace banner, presumably Robb and his close retinue. Ned descended to the main gate, ignoring the protests of some courtiers who insisted he send underlings to greet them. This was his son. He would greet him himself. The portcullis rose, and Ned strode out onto the open ground in front of the city. The approach party rode up, Robb in the lead, Theon Greyjoy beside him, along with several northern lords. Robb, still so young, sat tall in the saddle, shoulders set, jaw firm. He wore a breastplate adorned with the Stark direwolf, and behind him loomed the banners of Winterfell. The moment Robb dismounted, Ned took several steps forward, meeting his son's gaze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Robb bowed his head, a gesture of respect that twisted Ned's heart. Ned seized him in a tight embrace. "Father," Robb murmured, returning the embrace with the slightest quaver. For an instant, the warlike facade fell away, and he was again the boy who had once run the corridors of Winterfell with Jon and Theon. But the moment passed too quickly. Robb drew back, clearing his throat, donning the mantle of leadership once more. "The North stands with you. We've come for the Great Council." Ned studied him, seeing how he had grown in such a short time. The set of his shoulders, the earnest lines of his face. "Thank you, Robb. The realm has sore need of the North's counsel." Robb looked around, noticing the gold cloaks stationed at the gates. "Is the city peaceful?" Ned hesitated. "For now. Stannis and Renly are each here with their own forces. The Lannisters remain entrenched in the west, though Kevan Lannister has tried to negotiate for their release. We're doing everything we can to avoid a spark. Tread carefully." Robb nodded somberly. "We will. My men will camp outside, as the rest do." He gestured to Theon. "I've brought Theon as a sworn companion, as well as Lords Greatjon Umber, Roose Bolton, and others. We're prepared to stand by your side." Ned exchanged curt greetings with the northern lords, aware that some carried conflicting ambitions of their own. Roose Bolton in particular had a cold gaze that unsettled him. But for the moment their loyalty was to House Stark. That would have to suffice. As they approached the gate, Ned laid a hand on Robb's arm. You'll stay with me in the Red Keep, but keep your guard close and do not roam the city alone. There are eyes everywhere, and ears too. Robb nodded, as Theon Greyjoy gave a swaggering grin. We'll watch each other's backs, Lord Stark. Ned said nothing. He had not forgotten that Theon was technically a hostage from Balon Greyjoy's rebellion, though he had grown up in Winterfell's care. The lines of allegiance in this realm had become a snarl. They entered the city, greeted by a mixture of curious stares from the small folk. Many pointed at the northern banners or whispered that Lord Stark's son had arrived. The tension was as thick as the dust in the air. Ned guided them through the winding streets, eventually bringing them to the Red Keep, where the stable hands took their horses, and stewards led them to prepared chambers in a lesser tower. At dusk, Ned invited Robb to his solar for a private moment, away from the swirl of courtiers. Father and son faced each other in the lamplight, the door shut behind them. Ned offered Robb a cup of watered wine, which the boy took with a nod. "How is Winterfell?" Ned asked softly, longing in his voice. Robb's gaze dropped. "We keep it safe. Bran is well, learning to rule in my stead. Rickon is young but healthy. Mother is in the Riverlands with her father, who is gravely ill. She might join us, or she might remain at Riverrun." His features darkened. "There are raiders on some of our coasts, men from the Iron Islands perhaps, but we left enough men behind to guard the north. I couldn't come with fewer, or the other lords wouldn't respect our presence here." Ned nodded, understanding. "You did right. The realm needs to see that the north is not to be ignored." He paused. "I wish circumstances were different." Robb nodded, sadness flickering in his eyes. Then he took a breath and squared his shoulders. "Father, once this council begins, the North will have a voice. We want justice for the outrages committed. Not just for the falseness of Joffrey's claim, but for the meddling of the Lannisters in every corner of the realm." Ned agreed. "Yes, but we must proceed carefully. If we begin by clamoring for vengeance, Stannis and Renly will focus more on seizing power than forging peace. We have to keep them talking until all the lords gather." Robb set down his cup. "And if that fails?" Ned's voice was grim. "Then I fear we will have war, and a war that could tear the realm apart." "Do not let that happen lightly, Robb." The young man clenched his jaw. "I won't." They embraced again, both wishing they were in Winterfell's great hall, safe with the rest of the family. Duty bound them here, caught in the capital's swirling intrigues. Outside, a hush blanketed the city, broken occasionally by shouted commands or the clatter of hooves. The tension was almost suffocating, as if every inhabitant was holding their breath, waiting to see if this great council would indeed convene or if violence would erupt first. Over the next few days, more lords and representatives trickled into King's Landing. The Red Keep's halls became crowded with banners from every corner of the realm. The great hall itself was set for the assembly, with rows of seats placed before the Iron Throne, which remained conspicuously empty. A dais was erected, meant to house the highest lords and ladies, or so Ned planned. The entire arrangement had no exact precedent, so Ned improvised, doing his best to accommodate each major house without giving the appearance of favoritism. Yet, in hushed corners, men whispered that the presence of so many troops just outside the walls meant any vote of the council might be overshadowed by the threat of immediate violence. Stannis' war fleet still held the waters, while Renly's bright host camped to the south, and the Northmen stood to the east. The city was surrounded by armies. If the council broke down, the ensuing battle would be catastrophic. During this time, Ned also ensured that Cersei, Jaime, and Joffrey were not harmed. Although many demanded a trial immediately, he insisted that it happen under the auspices of the full council. Reports drifted in that Tywin Lannister was mustering an even larger force in the west. Ned could feel the loom of that threat. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, word spread that enough lords had arrived to commence the proceedings. The Great Hall was prepared. On a chosen morning, under the watchful eyes of 1,000 swords, the lords of Westeros gathered. Ned stood near the throne, not upon it, wearing the Stark colors plainly. To one side stood Stannis, draped in austere finery, jaw tight. On the other side, Renly, more flamboyant, flanked by Loras Tyrell and Margaery. Robb Stark and the Lords of the North occupied a large block of seats in front. Nearby sat Edmure Tully, representing the Riverlands, and several Vale lords in place of the absent Lysa. From Dorne came Oberyn Martell, his dark eyes glittering with contained anger, accompanied by a retinue of Dornish knights. From the Crownlands, a handful of local lords took seats with anxious faces, uncertain whom to back. Even the Iron Islands had sent a minor captain, though Balon Greyjoy did not come in person. Varys, Pycelle, and Barristan Selmy stood behind Ned, forming a kind of impromptu advisory circle. A number of highborn ladies and lesser lordlings filled the galleries, whispering in hushed tones, while the mass of guards ringed the hall. No corner was without armed presence. A hush fell as Ned stepped forward, cleared his throat, and addressed the gathering. The words he spoke seemed to echo in his own ears, almost as if someone else were speaking. Lords and ladies of the Seven Kingdoms, we gather under the shadow of great strife. King Robert Baratheon is dead, and multiple claimants vie for the Iron Throne. We have come together in a great council to determine who shall rule, so we may avert the horror of civil war. He paused, glancing around. We also face accusations of treason and false heirs. Queen Cersei Lannister and her children are in custody, and their fate hangs upon the findings of this council. Let no man raise steel within these walls, on pain of death. Let us proceed with honor. The tension was palpable enough to slice. Stannis stepped forward, voice clipped. I am Stannis Baratheon, the rightful king by all the laws of succession. I demand immediate recognition. Renly smoothed his cloak, smiling. I am Renly Baratheon, who stands ready to unite the realm through the love of its people. Before they could bicker, Ned gestured for silence. Then he spoke again. We will hear evidence on the parentage of Queen Cersei's children, as well as arguments for each claimant. Let the lords cast their votes at the end. Should the majority favor one claimant, that claimant shall ascend the Iron Throne. Murders, wars, and betrayals weighed on every heart present, yet here they were, attempting the impossible. A peaceful decision in a kingdom built on blood. Ned exhaled, steeling himself. This was the hour he had killed Robert for, the moment he had pinned all his hopes upon. If they failed now, the realm would drown in conflict. One by one, the lords rose to present their stances. The session dragged on with heated exchanges, calls for proof, and references to old genealogical scrolls. Pycelle droned on about the black hair of Baratheons for generations. Varys read out statements from certain confidants of the late Jon Arryn, who had suspected the truth of Joffrey's paternity. Oberyn Martell questioned the veracity of every Lannister statement, while the northern lords growled about the queen's treachery. Through it all, Stannis stood with arms folded, while Renly occasionally made witty remarks that drew scattered laughter. Hours passed. By midday, the hall was stifling, tensions at a boiling point. Ned called a recess, allowing men to gather in corners, whispering alliances, forming factions. When the council reconvened, more testimonies were offered. Maesters from various seats produced records that indicated Baratheon children typically bore the dark hair of their paternal line. The Lannisters had no counterargument that stood up to scrutiny, especially as Jaime Lannister himself was absent to defend his role, locked away in the dungeons. Finally, the question of Joffrey's legitimacy seemed settled. The vast majority of lords either admitted or accepted that he was not Robert's son. The hush that followed was laden with finality. Ned's heart pounded. If Joffrey was disqualified, the throne fell to the next lawful heir, Stannis by birth order, or so the law said. But Renly and his allies insisted that a king must be chosen who could maintain the realm's unity. The battle lines were drawn. Stannis stepped forward once more, voice carrying. We have heard the evidence. Joffrey is a bastard. By law, the crown passes to the next male heir in Robert's line, which is me. I do not come asking you for the throne. I come telling you. Any who stand against me are traitors. A roar of dissent erupted from Renly's corner. Loras Tyrell raised his voice, proclaiming that the realm needed Renly, not a sour-faced overlord. House Tyrell threatened to withdraw vital grain shipments if Renly was denied. Northern lords looked to Ned, uncertain. Dorne smoldered, refusing to back either Baratheon brother wholeheartedly, still nursing old wounds from the Targaryen era. Ned forced his voice to ring out above the din peace. "We will take a vote." He paused, then outlined the process. Each great lord or their representative would step forward and cast a token for Stannis or Renly. In theory, the majority would decide. A hush fell. No one had attempted such a direct election of a king in living memory, but it was the arrangement Ned had improvised. House Tyrell cast its votes decisively for Renly. The Stormland bannermen were divided. Some had followed Stannis for years, others had joined Renly. The North, at Robb's nod, largely cast their tokens for Stannis, out of respect for the law and Ned's caution, though a few smaller houses hesitated. The Vale Lords split. The Riverlands, led by Edmure Tully, also split. Dorne abstained entirely, claiming they had not yet decided. The tension soared. Hours of haggling ensued, reminiscent of a Free City merchant council more than a meeting of feudal lords. Stannis glowered, occasionally barking that this was a farce. Renly charmed fence-sitters with promises. Dorne refused to cast a vote until certain conditions were met regarding the punishments for House Lannister. Meanwhile, rumors of a Targaryen princess across the sea filtered into the hall, fueling murmurs that perhaps the entire Baratheon line was no more legitimate than any other. Some lords even suggested summoning Daenerys Targaryen, if the rumors of her survival were true. Night came, and the gathering adjourned without a final verdict. Tempers were high, and Ned saw the fury in Stannis' eyes as the man stomped away. Renly, more composed, retreated to plan his next moves. House Martell representatives slipped into shadows. Northern lords stood in clusters, awaiting Ned's guidance, while Tyrion Lannister vanished from the hall in that way he had of disappearing unnoticed. Ned's heart sank. Despite all his efforts, the council threatened to devolve into a stalemate. If no majority formed, or if enough lords withheld support, the realm would fracture into separate factions behind each brother. War could still erupt on the morrow. He gazed at the Iron Throne, dark and foreboding, remembering the day Robert had claimed it in triumph. Had he damned them all by ending Robert's life prematurely? Would it have been better to let Robert linger, even if it meant the realm might still slip into chaos under his neglect? Late into the night, Ned convened a small meeting with Robb and the loyal Northern lords, trying to chart a path forward. Roose Bolton, ever cunning, suggested striking a bargain with Dorne, offering them justice for old slights in exchange for their votes for Stannis. Great John Umber proposed simply encouraging Stannis to slay Renly in a public duel, settling the matter once and for all. Robb frowned at that, as did Ned. They parted with no clear consensus, only a grim acknowledgement that dawn might bring more intrigues or violence. And so the realm lingered on the edge, suspended between law and ambition, overshadowed by Lannister armies in the west, Targaryen whispers in the east, and the ghost of a murdered king haunting the Red Keep's corridors. Ned Stark, weighed down by the memory of steel through Robert's ribs, faced the looming sunrise with dread. He had reached the threshold of his great gamble. Now all that remained was to see if the Seven Kingdoms would remain united, or if his sin would unleash a storm from which no corner of Westeros could escape.